back here a second. Welcome everybody online and welcome everybody here for our presentation this evening. And we certainly welcome Paul Raushenbush and Maureen O'Leary from Interfaith Alliance. And so I'm going to turn it over to Carl to do an introduction of Paul to the group.
Yeah, just a brief introduction here. We're really pleased to have Reverend Raushenbush with us today. He has very generously offered us his time and energy to do this. So just a couple of things. Reverend Paul is the president and CEO of Interfaith Alliance, based in Washington, D.C. He's an ordained Baptist minister. And in the past, he has been the senior vice president at Auburn Seminary, founding and executive director of HuffPost Religion, associate dean at Princeton University, a senior advisor of public affairs and innovation for Interfaith America, and a myriad of other groups, always pushing for interfaith relationships in pretty much everything he's ever done. So again, we're just really pleased to have you with us, and away we go.
All right. Well, let me start by just saying this is like my pleasure to be with you. I just really appreciate all that you're doing. I want to, definitely thank Reverend Anne-Marie and Carl, but really everyone on this call and everyone who's ever been a part of building the Wyoming Interfaith Network. We really appreciate the work you're doing, and I want you to, if there's nothing else you hear from me, at least from my position and where I sit, I just want you to know how much gratitude I have for all the work that you're doing, the witness that you're offering, that the possibility of a democracy, a country, a state of Wyoming that is truly welcoming to all, and really treats everyone with dignity and respect. I just think that you're offering this amazing witness in Wyoming, and I know that isn't always the easiest environment, but I honestly will say that I think you're saving lives by doing what you're doing, and I just really appreciate it. I get your emails, so I love the Voices in Faith, the leadership program. I see all the programs you're doing, and I just know that for people who are just looking for, a just, a welcoming and inclusive community in Wyoming, that what you're doing is offering that. And so we are in common cause with you. We really, love and support you. And so I'm very grateful to be given this opportunity to be with you this evening and celebrate all that you've accomplished this year, and really acknowledge, like, sometimes it feels like, oh, we're just doing this. It's not nothing. It's everything what you're doing. It matters so much. And so I just want to say thank you, thank you. And make sure you take time to really celebrate, because we celebrate you. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'm looking forward to a conversation. But this will give you a kind of a sense of my broad overview of my understanding of the role of religion in democracy, and what we're up against right now in the across our country. So I want to start my remarks with a little bit of personal history to share with you how I enter into this conversation around religion in America. My great-great-grandparents on my father's maternal side came to the United States after the uprisings of 1848 in Europe, that were also known as the People's Spring. And some of my great-great-grandparents lived in Vienna, and some were in Prague, but all experienced the restrictions, taxations, and degradation that came from being Jewish in the Christian-dominated European continent. One of my Jewish ancestors was Joseph Goldmark, who I think, who you're looking at right now, who was a central figure in the revolution that took place in Vienna against the monarchy. And when the uprising was successful, Joseph was part of the first ever Reichstag in the history of Austria that was formed with an intent to represent the people. The government only lasted for 18 months before it was dissolved when the monarchy was restored to power, and Joseph was forced to flee as a fugitive to America. But during that brief time, they passed several groundbreaking laws that included freedom for the serfs, freedom of the press and the arts, as well as lifting restrictions on the Jews. Unfortunately, when the People's Spring was crushed, the laws protecting the Jews were quickly nullified, and retribution in Vienna and Prague and across Europe against those who had participated in the uprising was severe, and in many cases specifically targeted the Jews who had taken part. So Goldmark, along with my other ancestors from the Dembitz, Whaley, and Brandeis families, picked up their lives and moved to America. Arriving on the shores, my ancestors experienced freedom previously unimagined for them, a place where they could have dignity for who they were and no matter what religious background they came from. The freedom of religion was truly amazing to them, and they wrote back to their family members in Europe, expressing their love for their new country. Now, some of you may be asking how these Jews had a descendant who is a reverend, but we will save that story for later if you're interested. But the important point is the freedom my ancestors experienced was not an accident. The founders of America were thoughtful and intentional about the role that religion would play in the country, and they inscribed that intention in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It is very clear. So for anyone suggesting today that America was founded as a Christian nation, they are arguing against the First Amendment. And it wasn't just the Constitution. My Jewish ancestors arrived less than 6 decades after then President George Washington wrote his famous letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, assuring them of their equal status in the United States, telling Jewish congregants all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States gives bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. And if we needed more proof that the founders did not intend the United States to be a Christian nation, the Treaty of Tripoli makes it explicit. And many of us have not heard of the Treaty of Tripoli, but it's really important. Written by George Washington in 1796 to avoid war with Muslim nations over trade, the treaty was signed by John Adams and ratified unanimously by a Senate that was still half filled with signers of the Constitution. And the treaty says, and I quote, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any way founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religious, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states never have entered into any war or act of hostility against any Muslim nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between two countries." Thomas Jefferson, the third president of America, reinforced the First Amendment and coined the phrase, the separation of church and state, and showed his comfort with a diverse religious American nation by quipping, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to believe in 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." I mention all of these examples Because the next time someone says to you that America was founded as a Christian nation, they are factually incorrect and intentionally misleading you, rewriting history and attempting to superimpose a religious hierarchy onto a country that was founded intentionally to do just the opposite. I have a podcast called State of Belief, which this is a shameless plug, but it is really good. And I recently featured the Princeton historian Kevin Cruz, who explained, despite the founders' intent, later generations of Americans began to assert that the country they created was indeed Christian. Claims of being a Christian nation have also come with an implicit white supremacy that really translates to a white Protestant nation. My family experienced freedom in their new country in part because when they came in the mid-1900s, Jews from Northern Europe were granted a temporary status as white. However, the reality that they confronted was that a large portion of the population that was not white was also not free and not considered American. The brutal institution of slavery had been a part of the same country that espoused the value of freedom since the beginning. Just a few years after my ancestors arrived, the Supreme Court decided in the odious Dred Scott case that upheld slavery and further ruled that because Mr. Scott was of African descent, he could not be a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. The toxic mix of racism and religious bigotry was apparent in the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan marched 50,000 strong down the streets of Washington, D.C. against the full rights of Black Americans, Jews, and Catholics, and explicitly threatening violence against them. In the 1920s, laws were passed to restrict immigration through a quota system that promoted immigration from Western and Northern European countries to keep out the perceived dangerous influence of the Catholics and the Jews from Eastern and Southern Europe. These laws were also used to restrict Muslim and Hindu populations from the Middle East and South Asian that had been growing in the country. Again, the aim was both to restrict non-white races as well as non-Christian religions, non-Protestant Christian religions. Also in the 1920s, the so-called prerequisite cases decided by the Supreme Court denied citizenship rights to a Japanese petitioner and a South Asian petitioner on the grounds that they were not white. A few decades later, in response to the perceived threat of atheist communism, the phrases "one nation under God" and "in God we trust" were introduced into the common language of America. And in 1949 and again in 1954, the National Association of Evangelicals proposed a constitutional amendment to put God and Jesus in the nation's constitution, and it's worth noting, were defeated by a coalition of Christian and Jewish groups. The effort to put God and Jesus in the Constitution only further underscores the fact that those words are not there to begin with, intentionally left out in order to avoid exactly what more recent Christians have tried to impose. And here's another point that is obvious, but needs to be made. Religion is too often used for terrible ends. A powerful strand of religion was instrumental in undergirding slavery. Religion professor Harry Stout of Yale University wrote, "White Christians in the South didn't just support slavery. The Southern Church was the backbone of the Confederacy and its attempts to keep African Americans in bondage. Southern clergy had no doubt that slavery was not a sin." This support of white supremacy and the oppression of Black Americans continued after emancipation through Jim Crow, the battle over civil rights, and continues on today. Religion claims from the 1600s were also inherent in the doctrine of discovery, used to legitimate the abrogation of rights and takings of land of indigenous people for the last 4 centuries, and which was renounced by Pope Francis just this year. The examples of religious support for slavery and continued support for white supremacy, the taking of indigenous lands across the continent, and attacks on indigenous communities and their beliefs, often in the name of Christianity, is an important reminder that while freedom of religion is important, religion itself is not de facto good. And so when we talk about freedom of religion, we have to pointedly ask, whose religion and whose freedom? The language of the First Amendment makes clear that the freedom to believe as we choose is unalienable, but it is not unlimited. This freedom of conscience to believe what we want exists side by side with civil rights that ensure that every one of us can engage in our democracy with equal dignity. How we engage with one another is perhaps summed up in that legal truism, your freedom to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. The tension between religion and democracy has been present since the inception of our nation, and it has not gone away. In our time, Christian nationalism is attacking the principle of religious freedom that America was founded upon and represents an existential threat to our democracy. Christian nationalists revel in denying history and proclaiming our country a Christian nation that they conveniently make in their own image. They are determined to impose the imprimatur of their narrow faith tradition upon the laws of the land, using the power of the courts and government. And perhaps most dangerous of all, they use the rhetoric of a Christian nation with its underpinnings of white supremacy, xenophobia, patriarchy, and authoritarianism to dictate to the rest of us who is a true American and who will be relegated to a perennial outside status to be tolerated in just such a manner that George Washington declared should never happen. The goal of Christian nationalism is the establishment of a theocracy. As Catherine Stewart explained, again on my podcast, Christian nationalism is an ideology. It is a political movement and a quest for power. Unfortunately, Christian nationalism is not relegated to the shadows corners of our country. A poll recently released by Public Religion Research Institute and Brookings indicates that close to 30% of Americans are either adherents or sympathetic to Christian nationalism, and that among white evangelical Protestant, that number jumps to nearly 2/3. Over 1 in 4 Americans believe that the United States should declare itself a Christian nation. Not surprisingly, Christian nationalists hold remarkably higher negative attitudes towards the rights of Black Americans, immigrants, Jews, Muslim, LGBTQ people, and the role of women than the wider population does. I can't go through them all, but just to focus on attitudes on race. In the poll conducted by PRI, close to 80% of Christian nationalists disagree with the statement that generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for many Black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. The poll also shows that among avowed Christian nationalists who are white, 85% believe that the discrimination against whites is as big of a problem as discrimination against Blacks. So it is not surprising that Christian nationalists are behind the effort to ban African American study curriculum. It is not surprising that they want people not to say gay. No wonder they are banning books. No wonder there is increased anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hate overall. No wonder they are treating immigrants like props and sending them up to New York and DC. It is deeply grounded in the Christian nationalist worldview of how they want our country to look and act, and they are determined to get their way. As Catherine Stewart wrote in the New Republic, Christian nationalists are increasingly framing their efforts as a spiritual battle. that resonates with many of its followers that are more charismatic and from Pentecostal traditions. So Christian nationalists pits the power of Jesus, which is their side, versus the power of Satan, which, it will not surprise you, is many of us. This is not only being preached in churches, mind you, more elected political figures are taking on this language. Governor Sitz of Oklahoma prayed after his re-election, "Father, we just claim Oklahoma for you. Every square inch, we claim it for you in the name of Jesus. Father, we can do nothing apart from you. We don't battle against flesh and blood, but against principalities of darkness." What should a person from another religious tradition or no tradition think about their standing when the highest official in the land is praying in such a way as to explicitly put them in a second-class status? Not to be outdone, Florida Governor DeSantis was quoting Ephesians from the Bible when he claimed the mantle of God against all who would oppose him, saying during his campaign for governor, "Put on the full armor of God, stand firm against the left's schemes. You will face flaming arrows, but if you have the shield of faith, you will overcome them. And in Florida, we walk the line here." Now, for those of you who know Ephesians, you probably noted that he replaced what is in the Bible as the devil with the left. There are so many other examples, but these governors are two of the highest placed politicians in the country, and they are openly calling their opponents agents of evil, which puts politics into the zero-sum realm of spiritual warfare. Okay, one last piece of bad news, and then I promise we will get to a hopeful and productive part of my talk. Part of the PRI poll asked this question: because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. And Christian nationalists responded affirmatively at 7 times the rate of other Americans. Nearly 1 in 5 Americans assert not only that the United States is a white Christian nation, but they are also that they are willing to fight to preserve it. We all saw the result of this on January 6th in 2021 in the deadly attack on our nation's capital by insurrectionists holding crosses and waving Jesus banners as they attempted to thwart the will of the people in the election and subvert our democracy. But I can tell you harrowing stories from across the country. In our newly formed Interfaith Alliance in Southwest Florida, where a rabbi spoke out against Christian nationalists on the school board and was followed back to his car and intimidated and threatened. Or in Fresno, California, where a church affiliated with Interfaith Alliance held a fundraiser for LGBT people and had all of their sanctuary windows broken by the Proud Boys who left their card. This is happening, and we see it daily. So if you are alarmed by what you are hearing, you should be, we all should be. But that is not a cause to lose hope. There is a glaring disparity between the intentions of the founding our country to create a nation that would be welcoming to people of every religious tradition and belief, and the claims and aims of Christian nationalism in the 21st century. The good news is, as of now, Christian nationalism continues to be unpopular. 70% of Americans reject the call to declare America a Christian nation. Close to 75% of Americans said they preferred a country made up of diversity of faiths and not just Christianity. 80% of Americans reject the ideas that Christians should exercise dominion over all areas of American society. And Christian nationalist views on race, gender, immigration, and LGBTQ people are also unpopular and out of step with the majority of the American people. Demographic trends are also against Christian nationalism. The people who represent the core of Christian nationalism are older, white, and evangelical Protestant Christian, and all of those categories are in decline in this country. Before the 2016 election, the head of PRI, Robbie Jones, released the book, The End of White Christian America, which showed the decline of Christian and white populations and how America was becoming much more diverse in every way, including religiously. including the rise among young people who adhere to no faith tradition. So what is animating the Christian nationalist movement today is the most powerful and worst motivators: fear. Trump tapped into this fear with his backward-facing MAGA motto of 2016. And just a few months ago at CPAC, Trump warned his followers, "This is the final battle. If we don't do this, our country will be lost forever." They have made their goals clear and are attempting to hold on to power, and as polling shows, they are willing to do just about anything to achieve it. It is up to all of us to make sure they are not successful. And I'm here to tell you, we're going to win. I recently asked Rabbi Sandra Lawson, a Black, queer Jewish woman, what gives her hope in the face of her life lived at the intersections of so many identities that are under attack in America. She said to me, "Paul, we've already won. I see that we are no longer living in the same country my grandparents lived in. I see the progress that has been made. We still have a long way to go, but I see the progress is possible." I was shocked by her resilience and her positive worldview, but it was reinforced by another powerful Black civil rights leader named Eric Ward, who told me on my podcast, the biggest myth that the white nationalist movement and Christian nationalists want us to believe is that we're losing. But the truth is, we're not here because we're losing. We're here because the civil rights movement was actually victorious. It made the case that we should live in a multiracial nation grounded in democracy and equality. And here's the kicker: more Americans today, including white Americans by percentage, are supportive of that vision than at any time in American history. If we stand together, we can declare victory and refuse to lose. We will stand up to Christian nationalism by naming it and condemning it. And we will win by showing up and casting a compelling and beautiful vision for our communities, for our cities, for our state, and for our country that invites everyone to participate equally with dignity for people of faith and no faith to live their life freely. Together, we will celebrate an inclusive understanding of religious freedom and demand that our religious, moral, and ethical commitments around racial equality, marriage equality, the freedom of women, public schools deserve equal treatment to those who claim the mantle of religion but really mean it to benefit the few. We will support the right that, yes, anyone can believe anything they want, but it doesn't mean they can do anything they want. The right to swing their fist or their faith ends where our noses and our precious lives begin. Interfaith Alliance was formed almost 30 years ago specifically to counteract the outsized influence of the Christian coalition and the misnamed moral majority. The Christian right that had claimed to represent the religious perspective and attempted to impose their vision on the rest of America. Since that time, we've worked with people over 75 different faith traditions, as well as secular and humanist groups, to offer an alternative vision of how inclusive religious freedom can benefit a diverse democracy. We've started alliances like in Wyoming, we have in Colorado, we've started new alliances in Texas, in Florida, in other locations. A recent example of our work was in the fight for marriage equality in Washington, where Interfaith Alliance helped to build a large coalition of religious groups who proclaimed that marriage equality was part of our faith commitment and that we all deserve the right to love whom we choose. We specifically mobilized around the religious freedom amendments that were proposed by the bill's bipartisan sponsors, Senator Baldwin and Collins. And we gathered support from many of the major religious traditions, including the Sikh community that came out strongly for marriage equality for the first time. Senator Dick Durbin responded to claims from right-wing Christian groups that the marriage equality was anti-religious freedom by recognizing our letter as proof of the wide coalition of faith communities that more closely represented the will of the American people. This is just one example of proactive mobilization that can and must happen across the country to defeat Christian nationalism. Part of the reason the Respect for Marriage Act was so important as a piece of legislation is it's clear that the Supreme Court, with its activist majority, cannot be relied upon to protect a diverse democracy. We have to show up at school boards, at the voting booth, at our civic and religious spaces, and insist that America is for all of us, not just for some. We have to widen the circle of people who count in America, not restrict it. We can't let anyone flatten the moral arc of the universe. I'm a religious person. I'm a pastor. And I reject Christian nationalism because it corrupts my Christian faith and preaches a false gospel of bigotry. I am an American who loves my country and is grateful to this country for the safe haven it offered my family 175 years ago. And I love my country enough to want us to recognize our past and repair all that has been harmed and commit to a future of America being a place of freedom for all people. I want to show up to defeat Christian nationalism by showing a wide inclusion and being led by a love, even for those Christian nationalists who may hate or fear me. In our movement, we will fight for everyone, including conservative Christians, to be able to believe whatever they want and take their place in the mosaic of our nation. It is part of the definition of a democracy that we will live our lives alongside people with whom we will disagree. My deepest prayer is that we can invite people who think that Christian nationalism is the way they have to live out their Christian faith to join us in a wider circle of people of faith and no faith who truly want to live side by side with one another with mutual respect and understanding. Here's some examples of how that plays out. In the wake of the anti-Semitic incident in Southwest Florida, hundreds of people signed up to be part of Interfaith Alliance and to stand together to say no to hate directed at their Jewish neighbors or at any other group. In the wake of the attack on the Christian church in Fresno that supported LGBT inclusion, the Jewish, the Muslim, the indigenous, and other leaders stood up together in that sanctuary of that congregation and said, no, we refuse to let white Christian nationalists terrorize us and have the final word. And they petitioned the mayor to speak out and act against it. We will, all of us, show up alongside our Jewish, Sikh, indigenous, Muslim, Hindu, Jain, atheist, and Christian neighbors, all together to protect one another's right to believe as we choose. In our movement, religion shall be a bridge, not a bludgeon. In our movement, religion shall celebrate, not discriminate. In our movement, religion shall liberate, not subjugate. In our movement and in our country, religion shall be part of a diverse democracy, not a power grab for an exclusive theocracy. At a training recently, an Interfaith Alliance offered in Dallas, a pastor stood up at the end of the day and told the group, I feel less alone. And that's what I pray for all of us here today, for all of you in that room, that we feel less alone, more equipped, inspired by one another to show up for one another. The greatest example of interfaith advocacy in America continues to be the civil rights movement and the indelible image of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, walking side by side with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. That image brings me back to my great-grandfather in Vienna, Joseph Goldmark, who wanted freedom for himself and the wider Jewish community, and was prepared to fight for it on the floor of the Reichstag. But when the time came for discussion, it was his friend, the Catholic priest named Father Fuster, who stood up in 1849 and told the assembly in Austria why the Jewish struggle was his struggle. He said, if we free the Jews, we free ourselves from the sway of Christian barbarism, of tyrannical Christian bigotry. That priest's liberation as a Christian was tied up in the work to free his Jewish compatriots from oppression. we can and will show up for one another and our democracy that still needs every one of us. One of the sons of the Jewish families that came to America from Europe was my great-grandfather, Louis Brandeis, who became the first Jewish justice of the Supreme Court. And while he had much to say about the power of the court and politicians, his most sincerest belief was encapsulated in this quote: "The most important political office is that of the private citizen." So this is our time. This is our calling. Fellow humans, let's rise up and work together to ensure a welcoming, diverse, just America that celebrates the many so that we might truly be one. Thank you so much for letting me speak with you today, and look forward to conversation.
Just want to comment, that man can preach it.
Did you catch that, Paul?
He said, he called me a preacher.
He did.
I'll take it. Listen, that could be a slur, but sometimes that can also be a good thing. I'm going to choose to believe it's a good thing in this
I
case.
think that's the way it was intended.
One preacher to another.
One to another, right? If anybody online has a question, please put it in the chat and we will address those as well. If anybody has one here, please feel free to stand up and ask, or to stay seated and ask.
I went to a conference the last 2 days where the implicit conversation around Wyoming politics is that the division is getting wider and more intense.
Do you have a question with that? Or
Oh, does Paul think so?
do you agree? Is that what you've seen, Paul, at your level? That the division's getting wider in Wyoming and
Well,
elsewhere?
I can't speak about Wyoming, but I can say that I feel like that's a that feels like a trend that we can see also in Congress right now, in the in Washington D.C. And certainly in other places around the country. And so, my encouragement at this point is to still find good people around you, and to not I don't really believe that it's a time to knock your head against the wall to try to reach the most radical people who really are not, like, don't have your interest in mind, but to look around you and see, like, who are the people who I can talk to, who I may not see eye to eye on everything, but there are opportunities for collaboration. And I think there's a lot of people who are kind of fed up with the great divisions. And if we can find ways to speak in terms that are clear about our vision, but also inviting at the same time, and we may not win short term in some battles. I just talked to on my show, State of Belief. I just talked to two representatives in the state government in Texas. And, if there was a more grim place to be interested in kind of religious inclusion and diversity, Texas is up there. I won't say it's better, more than Wyoming or not. I know you're really up there too. But what they showed me is that they saw each other and they were working with one another, and they were providing an example of how one could work across lines of difference that was extremely compelling and attractive. And they're not going to win everything now, but they're building power, and they're building power in such a way that it feels like it felt vibrant, it felt nimble, it felt ready, so that when they could exercise that and really change laws, they'll be ready. and they are building friends, and they are, and so I just encourage us not to be discouraged, because the great, some of the great people we admire face times similar to this, and they continue to do what they were called to do, knowing that they might not win in the short term, but there was a long term that they were also called to. So I that doesn't really help with the wide divisions right now, but I do encourage you not to let that be so disheartening that you're not continuing to gather, to find common cause with people, and to move forward where you can, and provide an example of another way.
Anne-Marie, we have a, do you want to just bounce back and forth between virtual and in-person questions? We have one from the group online.
Go for it. Yes, please.
Amazing. Roger, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. I recently saw a poll that indicated that among a great many Christians, the term Christian nationalism is appealing to them because they see that as combining their patriotism with their faith. And what's wrong with that? And I think it makes it so critical for us to hear this message tonight, so that we have the vocabulary to go back into our faith communities and say, that's not what it is. And you need to be concerned about it, and here's why. And I want to ask you about your experience in when you talk to people who are inclined to think, what's wrong with combining my faith with my patriotism?
Yeah.
Are you successful?
Yeah, I mean, I part of what I try to be explicit about is that I'm a preacher, as someone pointed out. I'm also, like, I feel very American to my core, with all the contradictions and struggles that involves. I'm very patriotic in many ways, and so I think the trick of calling something is that the polling, what the numbers that I was using was polling that went beneath, like, the name itself and more into, like, what they meant by that name. And so, but the question of really defining, like, what, when we're decrying Christian nationalism, we're not decrying faith, and we're not, and we view ourselves as a very patriotic mission. What we're trying to decry is people who are saying this is a Christian nation are actually anti-patriotic, because they're denying the original intent of the founders, and they what they often mean by that is a representation of their own beliefs. They certainly don't mean it, the kind of Christianity that that I was raised in, which was a very progressive Christian tradition, which is a deep part of American tradition. They mean it in a specific way, and so, but you're getting at something that's really important, and that we need to reassess, is, like, how are we talking about what we're really talking about, which is the impulse towards theocracy and the impulse towards control and domination. And the people who are really Christian nationalists, the way I'm defining them, they don't shy away from saying, we want this to be a theocracy. We want Christians to have dominion over every aspect of American society, and everyone else is in second class status. They don't deny that. So if you come into a conversation, you might just ask them, do you think that Christians have a privileged status in America? Do you think that that this nation should be welcoming equally, and everyone should be treated under our laws equally, or should Christians have a privileged status? If they answer Christians should have a privileged status, and that we should declare this a Christian nation, they are actually a danger to the wider sense of thriving of religion. The reason we have such thriving religion is we don't have a state religion. And so I just think I would encourage people to go a little bit deeper than, oh, I'm patriotic and I'm faithful. Get into a little bit what the real definition that people are using, which is really about power.
Thank you. We have another question on this end.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear it. Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure I'm kind of toward the back, so.
Yeah.
So this is a long haul question. I understand that this is not a fix that's gonna happen overnight, right? My curiosity is, what are we doing to get this information into the school systems, the education system, so that as this next generation of leaders is raised up, they begin to become more aware of the dangers, the pitfalls that have been created by this separation between church and state that should be, right? I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but to understand the reality of what that entails, that you can be a patriot and you can be a Christian, but it's not mutually exclusive. It has to be a, both and rather than it has to be this way only. And I know that's tough because schools don't like to talk about Christianity, but we've got to do something to start educating the youth so that it doesn't blindside them when they become adults at 18.
Well, obviously, and you all are no strangers to kind of the battles over curriculum and, conversations about the role of religion, what stories, what information is permissible in our libraries and in our schools. This is a major actual battleground, and I think it's really important for people like yourselves in Wyoming and myself to really to not be shy. I was just talking to someone from Penn America. Penn America is on my podcast, so if you haven't signed up for State of Belief, please do. But it was about the censorship movement, and she said the most important thing is that people in small ways get involved. And I think that, what I would encourage is we should have books about, the role of Christians in American society over the years, like the abolitionists. That would be terrible for us to like prohibit that we want those kind of stories. But we also want stories about great Muslims in America and great Jews. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now is that school boards are being inundated by activists, and it can just be 2 or 3 people who can say, we want this books about Jews. There's something like 45 this year, 45 books about the Jewish American experience that have been banned across the country, 56 books about Muslim Americans that have been banned across the country. So it's up to us to go in and say, oh, you know what? We want to be a pro-religion, but also anti-censorship voice, and not let the people who are saying, oh, we want to protect the kids, own religion. I think that's like the kind of basis of the Interfaith Alliance idea, is that religious people can show up and say, you don't represent religion when you're trying to censor information. And I do think part of the opportunity in school is basic civics, so that they understand kind of like where, this history, like, honestly, I'm embarrassed to say how much of my life was lived not knowing about the Treaty of Tripoli. And maybe a few of you feel the same way, this is like the fact that all of the signers of the Constitution said America in no way was founded as a Christian nation. They all signed that, universally ratified. And none of us know about this, this document. So the opportunity is for us to make sure that as we respect librarians in public schools, we respect the teachers that are there, we can also be in the mix and say, hey, I just want to say thank you. And also, have you considered this? And come across it in a different way, because they are beleaguered right now. That is a battleground. And I do encourage you, and you're all going to get invited to this. We're doing something in DC that Maureen will be in touch with you about, but it's about censorship and faith, and how the role that faith can play in combating censorship in public schools, but the reality on the ground, and something about what we can do about it. So I appreciate your question, and I think let's make sure that learning about religion and democracy, the positive way that it has role that it has played, but not try to not succumb to the kind of influence that would say, we need to teach the primacy of the Bible. That's the definition of Christian nationalism, because who's going to teach that? You know, and you know, and maybe a Muslim student, that's just you know, an abrogation of the right as an American. And so I want to just, you know, again, I'm, you know, my big thing about teaching religion in school is like, listen, I don't know who's going to do it. So I would rather I do it or my people do it. So I'll stop there, but you get my vibe.
Virginia, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I have a number of thoughts. One is I just have been struggling trying to understand how people who claim to be Christians, you know, in the most vigorous way, how can they reconcile the approach they're using that seems to contradict the words and teachings of Jesus? You know, they seem to be, and well, like you said, any method to the end, which I guess they're only looking at the verse that says go out and, you know, spread the word or something. I don't know. But it just seems so contradictory to me. I can't figure out how they can live with that. You know, and
When you find
I
out,
also wonder whether some of that could be that if they aren't that vigorous and that dogmatic about it, that somehow they're going to go to hell. You know, that they, it just seems contradictory.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that this is surprising, but the history of the church is full of people doing terrible things, thinking that they're doing them for Jesus.
Crusades and
Just to name one. And so, you know, the truth is that, you know, every religion has this problem of how to exercise its faith. One of the advantages of being part of an interfaith organization or interfaith movement and is that we by stepping into this space, we recognize that we are refusing to follow some of the mandates that our predecessors have followed that allowed them, in fact, inspired them to murder other people. We're not going to do that because we believe that actually whatever our faith might have said about that, we're not going to do that anymore. Because we're, you know, and so, but there are other people who say, okay, my role, I mean, that was the crazy thing about like seeing the Jesus flags on January 6th is they're like, we're going to kill people in order to thwart democracy. And they felt like they were doing that for Jesus. And they were clear that that was true. And they probably still think that. And so we have to recognize that that kind of tension is King talks about it. Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about that in his work. I mean, people have resisted this, you know, things in the name of their religion for a long time. So it goes even, you know, the most powerful antidote to that are amazing Christians who show up in the other way and say, actually, I'm also a Christian. I'm coming here as representing my faith tradition. And you being maybe louder and more violent does not you cannot take away my right to represent my tradition. And my tradition is exactly saying the opposite. And so by even being present there, you are offering a refutation of who they are. You're not going to necessarily convert them, but you're going to offer a witness to a wider community. And you may save someone else's life and say, oh, I didn't realize there was another way. You know, I mean, so I just encourage you to recognize that this is going to be part of the deal, but then also think about how you can provide a witness that shows another way.
Maureen, why don't you go with the other question online?
Great, sounds good. So this is from Liz Hills. Liz, thank you. And she is wondering, do you think there is a way to reach those Christian nationalists who are being convinced that they are being oppressed, and that BIPOC, queer, immigrants, secular and non-Christian, etc. folks, and to reassure them that such folks are not actually a threat to them.
I mean, here's the thing. All of us have been able to change our minds about things. All of us have been able to grow and learn and transform. We have done the movement towards acceptance of LGBT people in this country over the last 20 years is miraculous. It's miraculous. When I was first growing up and, recognizing I might be a little gay kid, it never occurred to me I could have a family, a husband, a family. Those were not even words that we talked about. And now my nieces and nephews, they're just like, this is such a non-issue for them. Like they're just like, people really are questioning this? They're like, nah, not on our watch. So all I'll say is that meant that a lot of Americans changed their mind about this issue. And so what I encourage us to think about is, what messages are we leading with that might make a pathway for someone to say, oh, okay. I actually, I've never actually, sat down and talked to, a queer person, so one of the intentional parts about, what I offered before was, I make sure that in every speech I make, that I'm standing up for the rights of conservative Christians, conservative white Christians. I want them to feel like they have every right that anyone else has, but they don't have more rights, and they don't get to tell the rest of us how to live our lives. But they have every right to live their life. And they have every right to preach whatever they want in their church. And I don't want them to have to marry queer people. I don't want to force anybody to do anything. I want the government to recognize a marriage, but I don't want to have to. This is about freedom of religion. So I try as much as possible to say, what does it look like for you to feel that I'm really an equal to you and deserving of equality, and that you are equal to me? Because I think there's this. I don't want to overanalyze, because people they're freaked out. But if we offer, like, we're just trying to bring you into the circle and take you out of the center. And if it's possible for you to just hold hands with us and be part of the circle, rather than insist on being at the center, then we can all like, have a little line dance or whatever we do in the circle. So I guess I would just encourage, a big part of what I'm hoping that we all do really effectively and over the next years is think about the message that will resonate in our context, that will help, that will be welcoming, inviting. And then once people start hearing the vision, I really believe that people can change. People can change on race. People can change on religion. In the 1960s, 95% of Americans thought interracial marriage was absolutely the worst thing and was against the Bible. And now if you come out with that statement, you're gonna that's not going to go well for you. And so I just want to remind us that people can change, and in some ways the way they changed was being invited into a different perspective, invited into community, perhaps learning. And so my hope is that we can be, and it's hard because often I feel I get threatened, and so I want to strike back. And so I start using the fist instead of the extended hand. And the spiritual discipline of extending the hand rather than clenching the fist is part of our work.
We're all set on questions on this end, Anne-Marie.
Yeah, same here, I think. Any
Well,
other?
we're at 9 o'clock. I've taken up a lot of your time, and I certainly appreciate it, and really enjoyed it. And my hope is that I get to come out and see you in person at some point, and actually get a chance to break bread, because one of the things that I really, as I really love is being in community with people in situ. So hopefully, hopefully we will be able to make that happen in the maybe hopefully even this year. But
Really impressive view of Wyoming.
what's
What did
that?
you say? What-
What's that?
You'd be impressed with Beulah. Oh, yeah, Beulah's very, very tiny, but we have a great steakhouse, so you're welcome to come.
Listen, I am ready. I am ready. So we will make that happen. But certainly, congratulations everybody on this, on being together, on all the work that you're doing. I through Maureen, I hear about it, and I'm just really again so grateful for the work that's happening in Wyoming. And do let us know how we can be as supportive as possible for all the great work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to Maureen, because she and I talk a lot. So that's good. And she shares a lot of information with us, as you have this evening. And we really appreciate your presentation and sharing of answers to our questions.
You
So
bet. So be on the lookout for the invitation to our Hill briefing, because we really would love for you folks to be part of that and to be able to join us there. It's going to be really spectacular. October 18th, and you'll be getting more information soon.
yep, I think I saw that today. Thanks.
Okay,
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Reverend Paul.
Bye.